This is a CBC podcast. The word on the street is CBC Books is the destination for Canadian book lovers. Read reviews, enter contests, and watch videos. Listen to CBC Radio 1's Writers & Company and The Next Chapter all in one place. CBC Books, where readers click. Go to cbcbooks.ca.
Ayaan Hirsi lives in the shadow of the sword. Her life has been threatened, and she has been showered with invective for speaking her mind about the religion into which she was born. Her best-selling memoir, Infidel, was published in 2007. It chronicled her journey away from a conservative Muslim upbringing in Somalia. At the age of 22, she ran away from her country and her family, fleeing a marriage to a man she did not choose. She sought asylum in the Netherlands, where her outspoken criticism of Islam made her the target of Islamist extremists. In 2004, when a Muslim murdered Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh in Amsterdam, he stabbed a letter onto the dying man's chest with a knife, threatening to come after her next. Ms. Hirsi has since left Holland for the United States, where she is a fellow at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. She is blunt about the religion she has renounced, believing that, quote, the Muslim mind today seems to be in the grip of jihad. She argues that Islamic extremists are driven by a political ideology that is embedded in Islam and in the Quran. And she says acts of terror cannot be divorced from a religious doctrine that inspires them. Many liberals and others in the West are critical of Ms. Hirsi. Some have labeled her ideas hate speech. Last year, Brandeis University rescinded its offer of an honorary degree for Ms. Hirsi when student groups protested. In her latest book, Heretic, Why Islam Needs a Reformation Now, she launches a call for drastic reform of Islam. And this morning, Ayaan Hirsi joins me in our Toronto studio. Good morning.
Good morning to you. Thank you for having me.
Welcome. Nice to see you. I want to ask you about the cover of the book. It shows you just your eyes. The rest of it's covered by print. It's almost as if you're wearing a niqab. Was that on purpose?
That was designed, of course, by the publisher. And right. I think what publishers look for is to make a cover look very striking. And it is quite striking.
It is that, yes. Yeah.
So they did a good job on it. It's quite obvious that that's what it's signaled.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Before we get into the book, I want to ask you about the events of 2 weeks ago or 10 days ago in Garland, Texas, where this woman put on a contest offering $10,000 for the best cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad. And 2 young Muslims were shot and killed at that event. How do you react to that?
So the name of the woman is Pamela Geller.
Geller from New York.
From New York, and after 9/11/2001, like many other Americans and many other people in the West, she educated herself on Islam, jihad, on all the, bad stuff that's carried out in the name of jihad. She is a woman who loves and supports the State of Israel. And in her activism, she sometimes chooses ways to draw attention and the attention of the American public to the problems that she discusses. Now, you will say, as many people have, that her chosen methods of activism will not be theirs. But I want to support the fact that she chooses acts of imagination in response to the Charlie Hebdo PEN America wanted to give a medal of courage to the survivors of the Charlie Hebdo massacre. And a number of very prominent authors withdrew from that PEN gala because they did not agree with that choice.
Including the Canadian Michael Ondaatje.
And in response, many writers and journalists condemned their withdrawal. And one of them is Adam Gopnik of the New
Yorker. Another Canadian.
And
yes.
Other Canadians. But in Adam Gopnik's take, he draws a very clear line between acts of imagination and acts of violence. And Pamela Geller, you may like what she did, you may not like it, but she was definitely engaged in an act of imagination, not of violence. And I think if we can't just say we're going to defend the right to offend of the people we agree with or the people whose politics we share. We have to defend the right to offend for everyone, including for Pamela Geller, and I remain consistent in that. What we need to condemn, without question, are acts of violence in response to acts of imagination.
I take your point, but given the Charlie Hebdo events, given the whole Danish cartoon thing, it was a deliberate act of provocation, wasn't it?
It was definitely an act of provocation, but again, it was an act of imagination. And if you look at what the murderers of the Charlie Hebdo staff, and again, also innocent Jewish people, Jewish Delhi, just because they were Jewish, what they intended to do was for us to reconsider freedom of speech and the acts to offend. And some of us are clearly saying we should not give in. Pamela Geller is saying, I'm not going to give in. Nothing is going to stop me from doing what I intended to do. I'm going to protect myself, and I'm going to protect the people whom I've invited to this cartoon contest. But she is not, in my view, the one to blame. It's the two people who drove 1,000 miles and acquired guns with the intent of killing. Those are the people we need to blame and condemn.
You grew up in a fairly religious household, your mother and your grandmother. You were devout yourself.
Yes.
In fact, when the fatwa was issued against Salman Rushdie, you supported it. You supported the idea that he should be killed.
Without reading his book.
Yeah.
Without having ever met him. And in my religious conviction back then, I was convinced he had done something worth of capital punishment, of death. And I think that's where blind religiosity and the blind following and the blind submission to a holy book from the 7th century, that's where it gets you.
What changed your perception? Was it a long process, or was there one event that turned you around in terms of Islam? It
was a long process. It was not one event, but it's one event that actually forced me into a position where I started to think through. It was 9/11/2001, and people were debating, does this have anything to do with Islam? But I was of the camp that said, yes, it has to, because I recognized the motivations, the inspiration, why they did it. And then I had to ask myself, do I agree with them? And then if I disagreed with them, where did that put me in relation to the Prophet Muhammad and the Quran? That doesn't mean submitting, that would be disobeying, that's rebellion. And so then I thought, well, wait a minute. If Muhammad were to ask me to carry out any kind of immoral acts and justify it as something that God wanted, would I submit to Muhammad and the Quran, or would I submit to my conscience? And I chose to submit to my conscience.
But was it on the basis of the theology contained within the Hadith and the Quran, or was it something else? In other words, when you became an apostate, you also rejected belief in afterlife and God and all that.
Well, yeah, I didn't. So basically, I rejected the theology of Islam, the theology of Muhammad, the theology of the Quran, and I didn't then, after that rejection, seek to become a member of a new religion or a different religion. I have come to agree with the people who say it's humans who created God, because that's the main distinction: is God created by man, or did God create man?
And all religions are bad.
I do not say that all religions are bad. I say that, first of all organized religion is a challenge to liberty, but over time, some religions have evolved, and in the monotheistic religions, we compare usually Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and I see that the Judeo-Christian culture has evolved to a place where a lot of commands, very unpleasant and cruel in these holy books, is no longer taken to mean literal and is no longer practiced. And the big challenge with Islam is that the followers of Islam are saying, we're not only going to appreciate Muhammad and the Quran in the context of the 7th century, we're going to actually apply it now. That's what the Medina Muslims, or the group that I call the Medina Muslims, are trying to do.
You say at one point in the book that, some of the tenets of Islam violate common sense and reason and so on.
And human rights.
But couldn't that be applied to any number of religions?
Of course, they can be. And we've had these discussions and this critical scrutiny of the other two monotheistic religions, Judaism and Christianity. We're now at a place where 1/5 of humanity is Muslim, that a subset of that 1/5, the ones I call Medina Muslims, are actually organizing and mobilizing others to act according to, in my view, not only irrational but inhuman edicts. And what's baffling to me is that we are not attempting to have Muslims go through that same process that Christians and Jews went through of a reformation and enlightenment, and that we are simply saying, okay, there's nothing wrong with the creed of Islam, it's a religion of peace, and anything that's done in the name of Islam, that's just because these people are perverting it, and that's not going to change anything. In fact, I think that empowers the Medina Muslims.
You talk about Medina Muslims and Mecca Muslims. You say that you are a Mecca Muslim. Where? What's the difference? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think first I have to explain by saying I've been following this debate that there are many very different types of Islam. And I'll say now there's just one Islam, and it's not a religion of peace now because it hasn't gone through a reformation or enlightenment, but there are 3 subsets of Muslims. And there's one category that I describe as the Medina Muslims, and the definition is they aspire to live in a society that is ruled by Sharia law, or theocracy, basically. And some of the ambitions are local, some of them are regional, and some of them are global. And most headline-catching, one of them is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. But there's also Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, you name it. And then there is a subset that I think is the largest group, the Mecca Muslims, people who worship, and they may not even worship, but they identify themselves as Muslim, and they try to go as much as possible about their business. They do confess to everything that they say is in the Quran. Many of them haven't even read it, but they're embarrassed and disgusted by the acts of the Medina Muslims, especially those violent acts.
And they're not violent, the Mecca Muslims.
The Mecca Muslims are not violent, and if they're violent, they do not justify their violence in the name of religion. And then there's this third subset, a growing number of individual Muslims who are asking questions about Muhammad's conduct and about the Quran and taking it literally. And that to me is a healthy exercise in critical thinking. And they want to reject everything that's inhumane and subjugates women and divides the world into those who believe and those who don't. In other words, they're ready now to reject some of the basic edicts of Islam.
You say quite bluntly that Islam is not a religion of peace. Barack Obama says it is. The Pope says it is. Many liberals and writers say it is. Why do you say it isn't?
I distinguish between an Islam that our President Barack Obama and the Pope and many other world leaders hope for. It's normative. It's something that's not there but could be. Islam could become a religion of peace. Why do I say Islam is a religion of, at this moment, unreformed, a religion of violence? It is because these Medina Muslims take the Quran, the Hadith, the teachings and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and hundreds of years of jurisprudence and want to apply Sharia law. They're applying it. It's not just something that they're thinking about. It's something that they are actually actively applying it. There's a theocracy called Saudi Arabia. There's a theocracy called Iran. We see everywhere where Sharia law is applied that there is no peace. There's internal repression and external aggression. In that case, instead of just going on and on with this wishful thinking of Islam is a religion of peace, I think it's best to encourage that third subset of heretics and reformers to reform the religion from within.
But I take an inference from what you're saying that you view Islam as almost monolithic in terms of the Sharia law and so on. And I was a little confused by that because at one point you make the point that women in certain countries are not allowed to drive a car. But in Pakistan and Bangladesh, they're allowed to be prime minister. Doesn't that suggest that it's not monolithic?
So here is where, if you want to, at least in my book, the way I try to deal with the diversity of 1.6 billion Muslims. They are diverse, male, female, very different socioeconomic status, different languages, different cultures, different geographical contexts. It's that diversity that is worth exploring, because as human beings, you have to understand, okay, who is taking the religion to what we've now come to call violent extremism or even non-violent extremism? Who are the people in between who are frustrated and who in fact are the victims of the Medina Muslims? And then who is trying to make change from within? And then you take the doctrine itself. And the doctrine is pinned, obviously, there's the founder, Muhammad, who called himself a prophet, and the Quran, the revelation that he left behind. And then there are all these documents of jurisprudence. So that is the bundle of doctrine. And within that doctrine, up to this day, there are no radical transformations or amendments from its early years. And that's what I try to do in this book. I suggest these 5 amendments, and if these 5 amendments are applied to the doctrine.
5 Reformation amendments, yeah.
5 Reformation amendments, if they're applied to the doctrine, then we're going to have a separation of religion from politics.
I have talked to a number of young and not so young Muslim women who are self-described feminists and are quite comfortable living within the doctrinal matrix that you just described. How is that possible if it's so anti-woman?
Well, if it is a choice for women, and many women are anti-women and willingly accept a position of subjugation and submission, but if they do it freely, I have absolutely no problems with that. I just know that there are millions who don't have a choice. And I grew up in a Muslim household. I went through much of what is justified, the repression that is justified in the name of the religion. And many of us are now standing up to it. And there are movements in Afghanistan, there are movements in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Egypt, who are each agitating against one aspect of Sharia or the other, and that, I think, those are the women that we need to not only listen to, but to also empower and help.
So it is possible for a young feminist-oriented woman, Muslim woman, to live within the precincts of Islam.
I have no problem with it if she's free. I'm not a legislator. I'm simply taking part in a debate, and a very important, urgent debate. I just wouldn't use the label feminist to describe someone who covers herself from head to toe and says, I'm going to obey my male guardians unquestioningly. That's not what feminism, as I understand it, is about.
You talk about this troublesome word, jihad, which has come to mean, in certain quarters, as I understand it, of a personal struggle, that one is trying to wrestle with one's own soul, and that is jihad. You look on it as a warrior thing, as a holy war.
Again, I point to that body of doctrine, the jurisprudence, but also the many acts in history of when actual holy war was carried out. So jihad was carried out all the way to today. And I look at movements like the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab. They're implementing that tradition of jihad. In the period that Muhammad was in Medina, he carried out jihad. He carried out holy wars against the polytheists and the Jews and others that he termed as infidel. And here are 21st century people trying to emulate that. And in that sense, the term jihad cannot only be described as what of, some of the Mecca Muslims, the meaning that they cling to, that says it is an inner discipline. For too many Muslims, for millions of them in the Medina category, it is not an inner struggle. It is a holy war against the infidel.
But you're connecting this idea of holy war to the whole question of religion, and there have been scholars who said that the idea that religion spawns violence is a myth. It goes back to Europe and the 100 Years' War and so on. People like Karen Armstrong, who said there's no connection between the dictates of a religion and the outbreak of violence. And those young people you see joining ISIS, they don't talk about religion. They talk about going because the Americans have invaded. In other words, they talk about politics, not religion.
In Islam, as Karen Armstrong very well knows, There has never been a separation of politics from religion. That's what I'm calling for now. My definition of a reformation is let's transform Islam to become a faith that is about your own spirituality and not a political tool to conquer and to legislate and to carry out military activities. So Islam is not yet there. And it's good to fantasize about a religion of peace, but right now the reality is it is a religion of violence. And the big question for us is, can it change? When I was writing this book, that's the question I kept asking myself. And one of my students at Harvard said, if you take these 5 things out of Islam, you make these 5 amendments, what's going to remain of it? And I had to think that answer through, and I thought that question through, and I thought, well, we are told, when I was a little girl and I was being taught my Islam, there were 5 basic pillars of Islam. The confession that you believe in one God and that Muhammad is his messenger. Number 2, you pray 5 times a day. Number 3, you fast in the month of Ramadan. Number 4, you pay the zakat or look after the poor. Number 5, if you can afford to, you can keep all of that. All of that remains intact. But these other 5, the excessive overinvestment in life after death has created a narrative of death and is a death cult. Sharia law is, again, very inhumane. Jihad or holy war should be replaced with holy peace. The social control, commanding right and forbidding wrong, should be replaced with a narrative of tolerance and toleration. And taking Muhammad and the Quran literally in the Medina, but that should also be rejected. That is a much more useful and constructive idea and proposal than this insistence in denial that it's a religion.
Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I'm wondering how realistic it is. Asking Muslims to change, for example, their belief that the Quran is the delivered word of God is changing the essence of the religion. It's like asking the Catholic Church to, I don't know, ordain women or to, come out for same-sex marriage. How realistic is it that the kind of reform you're pushing would actually work?
That is a question. It depends on, whether you see the glass half empty or half full. We have seen human beings go through many, many changes that seemed back then when they were being proposed as preposterous and impossible and irrational. The history of the emancipation of women here in the West, the history of the emancipation of the black man from slavery. Again, the Enlightenment process in Europe in the Middle Ages, if you even talked about religious or doctrinal changes, you were probably burned as a heretic. Things have changed. It is possible for things to change. The only thing that Westerners and white people need to accept is it's also possible for Muslims. Just being born into an Islamic household doesn't mean that your mind can be frozen for all time.
See, I think it's interesting you mentioned the Middle Ages. When Europe was in the Dark Ages, Islam was the flowering of the human intellect. They were ahead of us in art, in mathematics, in science, and medicine. It was a glorious time for Islam.
Relatively. It was...
Well, certainly better than the Dark Ages in Europe.
Well, I'm not sure, and I don't want to get into that argument. But in any case, Islam has fallen behind. It has fallen behind because the so-called gates of reason were closed. It's fallen behind because critical thinking, those Muslims from within who would think things through and critically, were silenced in as many ways as possible, killed, ostracized, shunned, declared mad. Islam needs to empower Islam's heretics, that third category of people, and I think we need to help as well, and that's where the change, real, true, enduring change is going to come.
Empower heretics, meaning people like you.
People who ask questions.
My guest this morning is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Her latest book is called Heretic, Why Islam Needs a Reformation Now. It never had one. It never had a Martin Luther. Why?
Again, while I was doing research for this book, I came across many great minds within the history of Islam who could have become the Martin Luthers. Some of their work is lost. Some of them have been killed and silenced, and some of their works have been deliberately destroyed. So it's not so much that Islam never had a figure like a Martin Luther or other critical thinkers. It's the response from these Medina-type Muslims and their success in silencing those voices. That is the problem.
You write that Islam is at the same time the most decentralized and most rigid religion in the world. How is that possible?
Decentralized in the sense that Muhammad, when he founded the religion, said we are all equal before God, and he was the leader, and then everybody beneath him was equal. There was no structure of hierarchy.
There's no Pope or Archbishop of Canterbury. Or whatever.
No org chart, yeah. And as things moved on, we have, the various clergymen. Now we find ourselves in a reality where they're nation states, so no one speaks for Islam. And if people disagree on whether to take the literal meaning of some of these very disturbing verses or not, anybody can start shop anywhere they want. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is now calling himself the Caliph of all Muslims. But the king of Saudi Arabia is the custodian of the holy places. The Shia Islamic Republic, they see themselves as the protectors of the Shia. Complete chaos. Now, in that sense, it's very diverse and very chaotic and very crazy, but that is an advantage in the sense that then, instead of depending on these hierarchical, clerical clergymen who come together and every century probably make one teeny tiny step that they then set back the next century, it's better to have a bottom-up grassroots change by empowering those reformers.
But when Baghdadi talks about the caliphate, surely ordinary Muslims trying to live ordinary lives look upon that with scorn. That he's a psychopath, and this caliphate thing is just a fancy, it's a dream.
In fact, ordinary Muslims' lives are disrupted and have been disrupted by him and his caliphate. He's been killing and raping and murdering and causing...
You mean there? Yeah.
There.
In Syria and Iraq.
In Syria and Iraq. But here's an interesting thing. He's called on all Muslims to come and join him. And there are now thousands of people, some of them in free liberal societies, very prosperous and middle class, who are giving up their future, who are giving up their families, and who are sneaking out to join him. The question is then, what's driving these people who are joining him, and what's driving him? And it is this conviction that they are following in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad. And so sooner or later we can discuss politics, we can discuss economics, we can discuss social issues and justice, but sooner or later we're going to have to review some of the conduct of Muhammad.
In other words, you have to attack the central doctrines of the religion.
You can say attack, or you can say transform, reform, change, modify, renovate. I'm using my language. It's not as radical as, say, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the new president of Egypt, who says we need a revolution in religion. And that's the right direction to go.
But is it not hyperbolic? And I say this with respect. Is it not inflammatory? For example, you've said that Americans should be concerned about the growing number of Muslims in the U.S. They form, I think your words were, a violent threat, or a threat of violence. Every poll suggests that Muslim Americans are quicker to integrate, are quicker to assimilate, they're better educated, their incomes are higher than other Americans, and they simply want to live their life as American citizens.
American Muslims and European Muslims and Canadian Muslims and Muslims all across the world are targeted as communities, as families, as individuals by the Medina Muslims with an agenda to Islamize, to radicalize, and to transform them into extremists. It's extremely important that that agenda is exposed, and that agenda, in what is now the infrastructure of indoctrination or da'wah, preaching, Islamic schools, Islamic centers, Islamic seminaries, that for Muslim Americans and for Muslim Canadians, we need to be able to expose to them this agenda that is against them and against their interests. That's what I say.
But they're also targeted by people who hate Muslims, by bigots, by religious bigots who hate. Now, you don't like the term Islamophobia. Because
it's a mythical, it's nonsense. Islam is a set of ideas, and criticizing a set of ideas is not a form of bigotry against.
You don't think that they are targeted by bigots in the United States, in North America, in Europe?
Absolutely not. There are
Really?
people who disagree with some of the basic tenets within Islam that I also disagree with, and to highlight that and to point out why they are wrong is not to be Islamophobic. If there was, okay, I'll give you, everywhere there are bigots, but if the bigots had any influence or control or any say, we would not be seeing thousands, if not millions of Muslims head to the West, okay? We have millions of Muslims leaving their home countries because of all the problems that are going on through authoritarianism, poverty, and now these Medina Muslims causing problems, coming here. So I don't think that we should paint all Muslims within the brush of saying they are victims.
But there
In free societies, Muslims are not victims.
But there are countries in Europe, in Western Europe, where political party platforms say, in a xenophobic way, they should go back where they came from. They are a threat. They pose a threat to our children. They're going to impose Sharia law. Our women are going to be imprisoned, won't be able to act out their citizenship. In England, there's a whole wave of xenophobia directed against Muslims. Is that not true?
It's directed against immigrants who do not integrate into the value system of the society. And those parties, political parties, individuals who are organizing themselves, A, are a minority, B, they're opposed vehemently by the majority of these liberal societies, by the established press, by established politicians, and that is in itself very good. It's good to say we protect our minorities, but it is not enough, because in order to minimize bigoted and xenophobic measures against Muslims and other immigrants, it's extremely important that the mainstream politicians, academics, media people also address the trouble with Islam.
Your critics hold up examples of, literalist examples of Islam and present them as normal. You say that Sharia is not necessarily as rigid as you argue. There are different interpretations of it, and I accept that. But why do you think that your arguments, and given the fact that they are so articulately presented, find such a home in Christian fundamentalism? The right-wing religious bodies in the U.S. have made you their heroine.
I'm not aware of being the heroine of any organization that is right-wing or left-wing. My position is very clear. I was raised in the religion of Islam, in a Muslim household, in a Muslim community. I lived in Muslim countries, and to my great pain and despair, I am seeing, like you are, that the doctrine that I was raised in is used to kill, to rape, to destroy, to oppress. That's what I'm addressing. I'm doing so because I believe that through reason and through critical thinking, that small group or relatively small group of Muslim critics, Islam's heretics, will be able to persuade that large group of Mecca Muslims to reject and shun Sharia law, jihad, to invest in life before death, to reject commanding right and forbidding wrong, and to leave parts of the Quran and Muhammad's teachings in the context of the 7th century instead of trying to apply it to the 21st century. That is my message.
One of your staunchest supporters is the Reverend Pat Robertson. You've been on his television show a number of times, and this is the man who said that 9/11 was God's retribution against homosexuals. Do you think that weakens your credibility at all when you're
How can what insane people say about homosexuals weaken my argument? I have nothing in common with that man. I've never said that 9/11 was, that homophobia explains it or homosexuality explains it.
No sensible person would say that.
That's an insane statement. I have nothing to do with it. My life is threatened. I don't want to waste my time. I like to be, to have my ideas criticized and scrutinized. But how am I expected to explain that statement? My take on 9/11 is that a set of Medina Muslims who believe that America is at war with Islam came in and destroyed the Twin Towers, and were on their way to destroy the White House when that other plane was down.
And religion had nothing to do with it, did it?
Religion had absolutely everything to do with it.
It was politics. You just said that they were angry about the United States being
at war with Islam.
At war with Islam.
So Islam has something to do with it.
Yeah, but it's not religion. It's the United States at war with a group, with a cult, if you will.
I think I'll just leave it at that. I think it's good to agree to disagree.
Are you ever concerned, though, that your arguments, because you present them so well, and the rhetoric could fuel a backlash against ordinary Muslims and maybe cause an explosion, I'll use the word even though you disagree with it, of Islamophobia? Does that ever concern you?
There is a backlash underway in Muslim societies. The government of Saudi Arabia is waging a proxy war with the government of Iran in Yemen and in Syria and in Iraq. There are so many Muslims who are dying today, so many Muslims who are displaced, so many Muslim women who are subjugated in the name of Islam. I'd rather talk about that than a mythical backlash within liberal societies and figments of imagination like crazy words like Islamophobia. Again, I insist, there's nothing like Islamophobia. You can't, if you criticize a religion, you are not Islamophobic or phobic to that religion. How about, by the way, all of the Christians and all of the Jews that are being driven out of their homelands in the name of Islam? That is actual persecution. If there was persecution in Europe and the United States of America against Muslims, Muslims wouldn't be flocking to come here. Muslims here are free to go about their lives. If they're confronted with adversity, they have all these open channels to address it and talk about it and organize and, like all other groups and like all other individuals in a free society. Our free society is perfect. They are not.
Can you imagine a devout, non-violent Muslim who was critical of Western foreign policy in the Middle East being embraced by North American conservatives? Do you think if there was a counterpart to you and your criticism by someone who said the problem is the United States, do you think that he or she would be embraced by conservatives?
Conservatives interact and listen to and embrace, yes. Conservative Muslims or pious Muslims, the government of President George Bush was advised by many very pious Muslims and observant Muslims. I mean, I see no problem. Every leader, every conservative leader has his choice of advisors and people he or she talks to, but they definitely are very much in conversation with very pious Muslims. Let me tell you something. I don't know what Canadians think of the United States of America, but there are Muslims in America lead a life of complete freedom like all other Americans. Again, if they have issues, they have all the channels open to like all other Americans have, to air that. And as a Muslim, to live in America is better than to live anywhere else on the planet.
Do you reject the argument that some people have made, many people have made, that the United States, in a very direct way, is responsible for the creation of ISIS? That if they had not intervened in Iraq in 2003 and then not pulled out so abruptly and left the place in chaos, that ISIS would not exist today?
I passionately disagree with that statement. The United States of America did not cause ISIS. Radical Islam, or at least what we call radical Islam, predated perhaps even the formation of the United States of America. When the Ottoman Empire went into decline, Muslims were asking themselves what happened. And some of them were answering by saying, let's go back to the literal meaning of the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. And what we see in the 21st century is that group, that I call the Medina Muslims, have become large enough, strong enough, and have, of course, been encouraged and supported with oil money from Saudi Arabia. If you ask me, who is more directly responsible for the formation of the Islamic State, it's Saudi Arabia more than anyone else.
Bankrolling Wahhabism.
Bankrolling Wahhabism has created first Al-Qaeda and now the child of Al-Qaeda, ISIS. But where did Al-Qaeda come from? Muslim Brotherhood. What were the Muslim Brotherhood trying to do in 1920 when they were established to create Sharia? They have experimented with trying to reach that end through violent means. Some of them say that they've given up violence. I don't know. But we're also seeing the violence. Not the United States of America. Please. This sort of thing doesn't get us anywhere. It's like 9/11 didn't even happen.
Before we run out of time, if there was, looking at your call for reform, the 5 elements of reform, let's isolate one, and that's the treatment of women. What, in your view, would be the single most important and effective reform that would change the status of women in Islam?
It would be to achieve that separation of religion from politics, because if religion regulates or adopts this position of Sharia law, where then Sharia regulates the male guardian, every woman has to have a male guardian. Mm-hmm. Sharia regulates inheritance, marriage leads to child brides because the age of marriage starts with menstruation in Sharia. A woman has to have permission from her male guardian to get out of the house, to work. It's the male guardian's prerogative whether he sends her to school or not. If Sharia were completely obliterated, Muslim women today and their lives would be so much more better.
Let me ask you finally, a number of years ago, Salman Rushdie was sitting in the chair that you're sitting in. His life had been threatened. He had bodyguards. He had to use assumed names. You have to be very careful about your own security. What has that done to your life?
I think it reminds me again that we cannot take it for granted that the freedom of speech and the life of liberty that I have come to treasure and to cherish, we can't take it for granted. The Medina Muslims are a threat, and it has made me even more determined with every atrocious act that they undertake to come out and speak against them and voice and, this proposition of 5 amendments. It's my way of contributing to this much needed urgent discussion.
But what has it done to the way you live day to day and to your son? And how does it affect your life?
I can't talk about that. You know that I can't talk about that without compromising my security.
But it must be something that constantly affects your thinking and your activities and how you move about and what you do. But you can't talk about that.
I can't talk about that. You know that.
What do you want people to take away from reading Heretic?
I want people to take away that we need to support the heretics of Islam with that process of transformation and reform. There was a blogger who was killed today in Bangladesh. I read about it today, but he was killed yesterday on the streets. The blogger, a banker, writing about secularism and why reason is important, and gets killed for that. We need to support people like him. Let's not sacrifice more heretics.
Well, it's apostasy in Islam is a death. That requires death, doesn't it? To be a heretic. The fatwa was ultimately lifted from Salman. Do you think it will ever be for you? Will you ever be free of this?
Well, an entire generation of Medina Muslims need to be completely convinced and to abandon, the Medina narrative for me to live without security.
It's a pleasure to meet you on the radio. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
In. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is the author of Heretic, Why Islam Needs a Reformation Now. It's published by Alfred Knopf in Canada. This morning she was with me in our studio in Toronto. You're listening to the Sunday edition across Canada on CBC Radio 1 and across North America on Sirius XM Radio. My name is Michael Enright.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.